For 30 years, she never spoke a word, not to reporters, not to historians, not even to the fans who desperately wanted to know the truth. Lothian Skelton, the woman who stood silently behind one of America's greatest comedy legends, had carried secrets too heavy for public consumption. Until now. In 2023, at a tribute event meant only to honor memories, she did something that left the entire audience breathless. She stepped forward not as a grieving widow, but as a keeper of stories buried beneath 3 decades of silence. With a calm voice and trembling hands, she revealed truths the world had only speculated about, and what she said would permanently reshape how Red Skelton is remembered. The media had long been obsessed with Red's legacy, but the full story had never been told. Rumors had swirled about the mysterious shooting incident involving his second wife, Georgia Davis, about Red's controversial decision to destroy his show's recordings, and about the hidden sorrow behind the man who made millions laugh. Lothian had watched the speculation grow, watched strangers turn Red into either a saint or a villain, but she had never intervened. Until now. And when she finally did, it wasn't to clear his name, it was to tell the truth. Raw, complicated, and deeply human. She didn't hide behind emotion. She didn't offer rehearsed statements or sugar-coated answers. She spoke with clarity and precision, recounting things Red had only ever told her behind closed doors. The moment was not orchestrated, it was cathartic. She confirmed what many had whispered, but never proved, that Red had nothing to do with the shooting that left Georgia wounded in 1966, that he had carried guilt for her spiral into darkness long after they divorced, and that he never stopped sending her help, even as the world forgot she existed. But Lothian didn't stop there. She addressed the more controversial topic, the one that nearly destroyed Red's reputation in the industry. The one that led to lawsuits, anger, and years of confusion. She confirmed that Red had once ordered the destruction of all his taped episodes of The Red Skelton Show. It wasn't a rumor, it was real. But it wasn't out of arrogance. It was heartbreak, betrayal. A man who gave everything to television, only to be tossed aside as the culture shifted, and his brand of gentle humor was deemed outdated. In his eyes, destroying the recordings wasn't an act of vengeance. It was an act of self-protection. If he couldn't be valued for what he was, he would rather not be remembered at all. But audiences had loved him, and their love didn't die when the network turned its back. When he started receiving standing ovations during live performances in the 1980s, something in him softened. Lothian revealed that those moments were what made Red change his mind about erasing his legacy. He allowed reruns again, not for fame, but for closure, for dignity, for the people who had once laughed with him as a nightly ritual. This wasn't a man bitter at the world. This was a man who had once been crushed by it, then quietly forgave it in the only way he knew how, by making people laugh again. In just a few minutes on stage, Lothian Skelton didn't just speak for Red, she reframed him. She pulled the curtain back on a man the world thought it already knew and exposed the cracks, the pain, and the quiet dignity he had lived with until his last breath. It wasn't just a confession, it was a restoration of truth. And if you listened closely, you could hear the whisper of Red's voice in her words, soft, honest, and filled with the kind of sorrow only love can carry. But this was only the beginning. Because to truly understand why her revelations mattered, why they struck such a deep chord, we must go back. Back to the cold, hungry nights of Indiana. To the little boy who had nothing, and yet gave the world everything. He was born into a world that seemed determined to break him before he even had the chance to stand. In 1913, Vincent's Indiana wasn't the kind of place dreams were born. It was where they went to die in silence. Red Skelton came into that world with nothing. No wealth, no comfort, not even a father to guide him. His father died before he was born, a ghost figure whose identity remained a mystery tangled in speculation and folklore. Some said he was a clown. Others claimed he was a lawyer or a telephone worker. But to Red, he was just an empty chair at the table, a silence that shaped everything he would become. Red's childhood wasn't just poor, it was brutal. His mother, Ida May, cleaned houses for pennies, doing whatever she could to feed her children. though meals were scarce and winters were colder than the attic they slept in. Red learned early that hunger wasn't just in the stomach, it was in the soul. By the age of 10, he dropped out of school and hit the streets, selling newspapers just to keep the family afloat. There was no time to be a child, no room for dreams, just survival. But even in the darkest corners of despair, fate can find a way in. One cold morning, while hustling papers on the street, young Red crossed paths with a man who didn't just buy his stack, he changed his life. That man was Ed Wynn, a famous vaudeville performer. Instead of walking away after paying the boy, Wynn offered him something that would alter his course forever: a ticket to a vaudeville show. For Red, it was like opening a window in a world without air. That single moment, simple and unexpected, awakened something buried beneath the weight of hardship. A craving not for food or warmth, but for applause, for laughter, for purpose. From that day on, Red wasn't just trying to survive. He was chasing the feeling that show gave him the feeling of being somewhere he truly belonged. At 15, he packed what little he had and left home, not out of rebellion, but desperation. "I left because I was hungry," he later said. But the hunger wasn't for bread. It was for meaning, for identity, for a chance to create something out of nothing. He joined traveling circuses, climbed aboard riverboats, and threw himself into medical shows and burlesque acts. He worked with anyone who would have him, doing anything that could get a laugh. His routines weren't polished. His material was crude. But he watched. He studied. He learned how to control a room not with power, but with rhythm, with timing, with humility. He was never the loudest or flashiest, but he had something others didn't: sincerity. Comedy, for Red Skelton, wasn't a choice. It was a lifeline, the only thing standing between him and the emptiness that waited every night when the lights went down. What Red built in those years wasn't fame, it was foundation. In tents and dusty backrooms, in small towns that forgot his name as soon as he left, he was crafting something greater than applause. He was building the tools he would later use to climb out of obscurity and into the heart of American culture. But even then, surrounded by strangers and laughter, Red carried a secret. Every joke he told carried the weight of a boy who had once gone to bed cold, aching not for food, but for someone to tell him he mattered. And one day, he would make the whole world laugh, just so he wouldn't feel invisible again. But before that day would come, Red had to climb higher, push harder, and take the stage in a way no one could ignore. Because from the ashes of poverty, a legend was about to rise. He didn't walk into fame. He danced, stumbled, and pantomimed his way into it. From the sidewalks of poverty to the glitter of Hollywood, Red Skelton carved out a space in America's heart by doing something very few could. He made people laugh when they needed it the most. But this wasn't overnight success. It was grit wrapped in grease paint. It was tragedy transformed into timing. It was heartbreak dressed up in humor. And it all began with a simple act called Donut Dunkers. That one routine, born from scraps of imagination and his first wife Edna Stilwell's sharp edits, lit up the vaudeville stage like a match in a dark tunnel. The act wasn't just funny, it was electric. Red didn't rely on words. He didn't need elaborate props. With nothing but body language, a few props, and a rubber face that could express more than an entire script, Red stole the show. And America noticed. The doors that had once been slammed shut due to poverty and obscurity began to creak open. Radio soon came calling, and Red's voice, clever, innocent, and charmingly mischievous, became a weekly fixture in millions of homes. By the late 1930s, Red was everywhere. From the Fleischmann's Yeast Hour to Avalon Time, he lit up the airwaves with a new kind of comedy, one that didn't insult, didn't shock, but still left you gasping with laughter. Then came Hollywood. MGM saw in Red what others had overlooked, a box office goldmine with depth. They signed him in 1940, and over the next 2 decades, Red starred in more than 30 films. Whether he was playing a clueless detective in Whistling in the Dark or a heartbroken clown in The Clown, Red could make you laugh and cry without ever breaking character. But it wasn't just his roles that evolved, it was his craft. Red formed a deep bond with silent film legend Buster Keaton. Keaton, a master of visual storytelling, helped sharpen Red's comedic instincts. Their friendship wasn't just professional, it was transformative. Keaton taught him that silence could speak, louder than punchlines. That pain, when shaped right, could make people laugh without ever feeling cruel. Red absorbed it all, folding it into his performances, creating something entirely his own, a mix of slapstick and soul. Then, in 1951, came the moment that would define him forever, the Red Skelton Show. What started on NBC soon moved to CBS and became a television staple for the next 20 years. But Red didn't rely on celebrity guests or gimmicks. He built a universe from scratch, one character at a time. Freddie the Freeloader, the silent tramp who never spoke, but always moved your heart. Clem Cadiddle Hopper, the lovable, slow-witted country bumpkin with an oversized grin. Junior, the mean whittle kid, a mischievous rascal with unforgettable one-liners. And of course, Gertrude and Heathcliff, the bickering seagulls whose snide remarks somehow reflected human absurdity. These weren't just characters. They were mirrors. They reflected the joys and pains of the people watching at home. Red's comedy wasn't just entertainment, it was companionship. During a time when the world was recovering from war, confronting civil unrest, and heading into an era of transformation, Red's show offered something rare: safety, laughter without venom, humor without humiliation. It was no surprise that each episode ended with a phrase that felt more like a prayer than a catchphrase. Good night, and may God bless, but behind the curtain, something else was unfolding. Because while Red Skelton was winning the nation's heart, his own was slowly breaking. He made the world laugh. Night after night, with painted smiles and timeless characters, Red Skelton offered joy to millions. But behind that laughter lived a pain that never left the stage. Because while audiences saw the comedian, few ever glimpsed the man broken, grieving, and haunted by tragedies he never dared speak aloud. His private life, so carefully hidden from the spotlight, was riddled with heartbreaks that would have shattered anyone else. Yet somehow, Red kept performing, until the mask itself began to crack. His first marriage to Edna Stillwell was born in hardship and ambition. She wasn't just his wife, she was his editor, his co-writer, his business partner. Together, they built the early foundation of his career. But success does strange things to love. As Red's fame grew, the marriage crumbled. They divorced in 1943, but what was rare and telling was that they continued working together for nearly a decade afterward. There was no animosity, no public scandal, only silence. Like so many of Red's personal chapters, it ended without applause. Then came Georgia Davis, a beautiful singer, bright and full of life. For a moment, it seemed Red had found a kind of peace. They had 2 children, and the family was often photographed looking picture-perfect. But what the camera didn't capture was the slow, silent devastation that would soon unravel everything. Their son Richard was diagnosed with leukemia. Red, the eternal optimist on screen, became a desperate father off it. He and Georgia tried everything, every doctor, every treatment, every miracle they could chase. But none of it worked. Richard died in 1958, just shy of his 10th birthday. The day of the funeral, Red went on stage. He performed his show as if nothing had happened. There were no cracks in the performance, no signs of the storm inside him. But behind the curtain, he collapsed. That wasn't bravery, it was survival. Red once said comedy was his only way to keep breathing. That night, he wasn't performing for an audience, he was fighting to stay alive. Georgia wasn't as resilient. The grief consumed her. Depression dug in deep, and soon, alcohol became her escape. Their once loving marriage turned distant, then cold, and eventually fractured under the weight of unspoken sorrow. Red tried to help, but he couldn't carry her pain and his own. Their relationship began to unravel in the shadows, far from the eyes of the public. Then, in 1966, something happened that changed everything. Georgia was found shot in the chest with a .38 pistol in a hotel room during a tour with Red. She survived, but the story didn't. The official statement claimed it was an accident self-inflicted, perhaps while handling a firearm she kept for protection. But no details ever surfaced. And Red? He never addressed it publicly. not once. Rumors swirled, some accusing, others sympathetic. But the truth remained locked behind hotel walls and silent lips. For years, that incident became a dark stain on an otherwise glittering career. Fans whispered, the press speculated. But Red stayed silent because sometimes silence is safer than truth. Even after their divorce in 1971 and Georgia's eventual death in 1976, Red carried that burden. Those close to him said he never truly let go of the guilt. He believed, deep down, that he had failed her, failed his son, failed as a husband. And yet, night after night, he stood before audiences, delivering laughter like a gift, even when his own world had fallen apart. And that one unsolved mystery, the gunshot, the silence, the pain remained frozen in time. Until decades later, when someone who had loved Red in his final years would finally decide that the truth couldn't remain buried forever. It took 30 years. 30 years of silence, whispers, and unresolved questions. But in 2023, under the soft lights of the Red Skelton Theater in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, the silence finally broke. Lothian Skelton, Red's third and final wife, stepped onto that stage not to entertain, but to set the record straight. She hadn't spoken publicly in decades, but when she did, the room held its breath because what she said shattered years of rumor, restored dignity to a wounded legacy, and revealed the aching truth behind the smile that had once charmed an entire nation. She started with the moment that haunted everyone, the moment Red never addressed. The 1966 shooting incident that left his ex-wife Georgia Davis wounded, and the public speculating wildly. Some called it an accident. Others whispered of darker things. But no one knew what really happened until now. Lothian spoke calmly, but her words carried weight. It was an emotional accident, she said. A moment of despair, not malice. Georgia had been spiraling since their son's death. The grief had cracked her spirit. And Red, despite being divorced, never truly left her behind. He stayed in contact. He sent money. He offered quiet support from afar. But he never forgave himself for not being able to pull her out of the darkness. Even though it wasn't his fault, he carried it like it was. And that guilt, the guilt of failure, of loss, of being unable to save the ones he loved, bled into something else, something that would later threaten to erase everything he had built. Lothian confirmed what many had dismissed as myth, that Red had once ordered all recordings of the Red Skelton show to be destroyed. Every episode, every performance. Gone. It sounded unthinkable, but it was real. Red had written it into his will, not out of hatred for his fans, but as a message to the industry that had turned its back on him. CBS had canceled his show despite its popularity, branding it outdated. For Red, it wasn't just a career blow, it was betrayal. A brutal dismissal of a man who gave his heart night after night to the American people. That order wasn't rage. It was heartbreak with legal ink. But even the deepest bitterness can be undone by love. And Red's fans never left him. They showed up for his live shows. They wrote him letters. They applauded not because he was famous, but because he still mattered. Lothian recalled how those moments softened him, how they reached places in him the television executives never could. Slowly, Red withdrew the clause. He allowed reruns again. He stopped talking about destroying the tapes, not because the pain had vanished, but because the love had overpowered it. For Lothian, this wasn't just about correcting facts. It was about showing the world the man behind the performance. A man who had suffered enormous losses, made human mistakes, and still chose to give the world laughter. That night, her voice didn't tremble. It rang with quiet certainty. She didn't dramatize. She didn't embellish. She just revealed. And in doing so, she didn't just defend Red's memory, she gave it back its soul. But that wasn't the end of the story. Because after Red walked away from the camera and applause, he stepped into a new chapter, one no one expected, and very few ever witnessed. When the lights finally dimmed and the cameras stopped rolling, Red Skelton didn't look for another stage. He didn't chase a comeback or plead for relevance in a changing world. Instead, he disappeared voluntarily, intentionally, and almost entirely. In the rugged solitude of Anza, California, far from the noise of Hollywood and the weight of public expectation, Red chose a life few understood. He withdrew to a ranch tucked high in the hills, where the only audience left was the wind through the trees and the breath of the horses he raised. There, in silence, he finally allowed himself to become what he had always been, behind the makeup a man trying to heal. They called him many things: a clown, a genius, a relic. But in the final chapter of his life, the New York Times gave him a new name: a Zen monk. It wasn't just poetic, it was accurate, because Red embraced the discipline of quiet. Each morning, he painted. Not for fame, not for gallery approval. He painted clowns, sad, thoughtful, hollow-eyed faces that seemed to stare back at him from the canvas. They weren't caricatures, they were mirrors. Each one captured a part of him he had never allowed to live on stage. The loneliness, the fatigue, the wounds no laughter could cure. But Red didn't stop there. He wrote short stories every day, sometimes 2 or 3 in a sitting. And in a revelation that stunned even those closest to him, he composed over 8,000 pieces of music symphonies, melodies, compositions scribbled in silence, shared with no one. Most were never performed. Some were never even titled. They were simply expressions, a form of emotional breathing. Where most men in their final years seek closure, Red was creating more than ever, except this time, he didn't need validation. He refused interviews. He didn't own a television. He didn't read reviews. He barely answered the phone. His circle shrank down to family and a handful of trusted friends. And yet, this wasn't isolation born from bitterness. It was peace, earned after decades of noise. For Red, applause had once been a form of survival. Now, it was no longer necessary. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. And in that stillness, he found something far more elusive than fame. He found contentment. People often mistook his retreat for sadness, assuming he had been broken by the industry. But they were wrong. Red hadn't walked away because he was defeated. He walked away because he had given enough. Every joke, every character, every performance had been a gift. And now, he was keeping something for himself. And yet, while Red withdrew, his story didn't end. In the background, someone else was quietly preserving the essence of the man behind the myth. Someone who had loved him through the silence and stood ready to ensure that the world would one day remember not just the performer, but the soul. Because as Red faded into the quiet hills of California, Lothian Skelton stepped forward and reignited his legacy. Television moved on. New stars rose. New trends took hold. And Red Skelton, once a fixture in every American living room, faded quietly from the screens that once made him immortal. The industry that had built him seemed content to forget him. But one person wasn't. One woman refused to let history write him off as a relic of a bygone era. Lothian Skelton, his widow and keeper of his truest self, took it upon herself to preserve more than just his memory. She fought to preserve his meaning. She began with the artifacts, the scripts handwritten in pencil, the clown paintings stained. With unspoken emotion, the stage costumes still carrying the scent of performance and heartbreak. These weren't props. They were fragments of a soul. Lothian donated them to Vincennes University Red's hometown, his alma mater, and the place that had first nurtured his spark. From those pieces, something extraordinary emerged. The Red Skelton Museum. Not a celebrity exhibit, a sanctuary. One that told the story of a man, not just a performer. One that let people see beyond the characters and into the conflict, the passion, the pain. And that was only the beginning. In Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, the Red Skelton Memorial Theater came to life. Night after night, actors breathed life back into Freddie the Freeloader, Clem Cadiddlehopper, and Junior the Mean Whittle Kid. But this wasn't nostalgia, it was resurrection. Generations who had never heard Red's name were suddenly laughing, learning, and wondering how such a soul could have been forgotten in the first place. Lothian wasn't just honoring his past, she was reintroducing him to the future. Even the legal battles couldn't stop her. Decades earlier, Red's refusal to allow reruns had led to lawsuits and outrage from writers who lost their royalties. The tapes were nearly destroyed forever. But now, because of Lothian's tireless work and quiet diplomacy, those same episodes began surfacing again, aired, streamed, shared. What was once considered lost to bitterness was now a celebration of timeless comedy. And this time, the audience was bigger than ever. Red Skelton's legacy no longer lived in primetime slots or ratings charts. It lived in hearts, in classrooms, where students studied his pantomimes, in theaters where his characters breathed again, in homes where grandparents passed down laughter like family heirlooms. What the industry cast aside, the people reclaimed. And it wasn't because of marketing or algorithms, it was because his work had soul, because someone had loved him enough to protect it. But even as the world began to rediscover Red, another question quietly rose. Who was he really? Beyond the paint, beyond the stage, beyond the stories carefully chosen for public comfort. The more his myth grew, the more people wondered what they had missed. What secrets were still hidden behind the smile? And as new generations clung to his legacy, one final layer of truth waited to be revealed. He made the world laugh until their sides hurt. But inside, Red Skelton was aching in ways no one saw. Behind the painted face, behind the lovable characters, lived a man whose truth was far more complicated than the public ever imagined. Because Red wasn't just a clown. He wasn't just a television icon or a comedy pioneer. He was a mystery one, shaped by loss, haunted by silence, and driven by a deep, unspoken need to be understood. And perhaps the greatest mystery of all was Red's own origin. For most of his life, Red told the world that his father was a circus clown who died before he was born. It was a poetic story, fitting for a man who became America's greatest funny man. But years later, documents emerged. It told a different tale. Some claimed his father was a lawyer. Others said he was a telecommunications technician. One theory even suggested he abandoned the law after a moral crisis, retreating into obscurity under a different name. Whether Red truly believed the circus story or chose it because it fit his image, no one could say for certain. But the truth was this: he carried a myth because the reality was too fractured to hold on to. And that myth-making didn't end with his childhood. In private recordings leaked long after his death, Red could be heard joking with his longtime friend and fellow performer, Martha Raye. But these weren't the wholesome, family-friendly jokes he was famous for. These were raw, sarcastic, sharp. The tapes revealed a Red Skelton that the public never saw a man unfiltered, irreverent, and deeply cynical about the industry he once gave everything to. Some were shocked. Others felt betrayed. But those who knew him best, including Lothian, weren't surprised at all. She once said, "Everyone has a part of their mind they never share." Red kept his separate, so people could laugh at the part he did show. It wasn't deception. It was self-preservation. The man who had lost a child, who had stood beside two wives as they unraveled in front of him, who had been cast aside by the very network he helped build, he needed somewhere to put the pain. And if that meant dividing himself into two, one for the stage, one for the silence, then so be it. But that division wasn't without consequence. The grief, the guilt, the betrayal, it bled into his art, into the eyes of his painted clowns, into the music he never released, into the short stories he wrote just for himself. The world thought he stopped performing because time had passed him by. But in truth, Red was tired of pretending. He didn't want to be frozen in a smile that no longer matched the soul behind it. And that's the part the world is only now beginning to understand. Red Skelton was never meant to be perfect. He was meant to be real, complex, contradictory, full of flaws and brilliance and bruises. That's what made him timeless, not just the laughter he gave, but the truth he hid behind it. And maybe that's the greatest legacy of all. Not that he was always smiling, but that he kept showing up again and again, even when smiling was the hardest thing to do. Red is gone, but his story didn't end with him. It echoes now, louder than ever, carried in every gasp of laughter, every tear that falls behind a smile, and every generation that looks beyond the face paint and sees the man who gave everything he had, just to make the world feel a little lighter. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.